So I've been talking about geology as a science, but what what is science anyway? Well, we can take your textbook definition that you learned in elementary school and that you learned the scientific method, right? Except that's not really how science works. It works pretty well if you're teaching second graders how to do a really easy experiment, right? You say, what happens when I mix the baking soda and vinegar together? Then we make a guess and you do it, right? Except this isn't really how science works. But at its core, science is more of a way of thinking, a way of figuring things out. So you may use science every day of your life and not really think about it, right? Like, you're like, man, what should I wear today? Well, you can go outside and it's hot. We're in Mesa, right? It's always hot. You can say, well, do I need to bring an umbrella? You look around, you don't see any clouds in the sky. You take that observation and interpret it as a probably good, and it's probably not going to rain. So now you know what to wear, you know what to bring with you when you're set. That's using science. It's just sort of asking questions, wondering about something, and then using that information to back it up or to make decisions. It's not just about, collecting the data and making conclusions, but a lot of times, the results of scientific research are used to make really important decisions. Where do we live? What kind of protection do we need to build against floods? How can we extract enough petroleum products to keep us on the road and all of our cars driving at the rate we are now? So there's some really important things that are decided in geology and in science in general. So here's my version of the scientific method. You will notice it is much longer. And the other thing you'll probably notice is as you read down, you see start again a lot. Because, there's the hardest thing in science sometimes is, finding a question nobody's asked. Now, there's a lot of stuff we don't understand, right? But picking something you want to understand, like, what are the chemicals that the life uses on the ocean floor to survive without any sunlight? It's pretty cool. They actually do that. Well, you can study that. So now you got something you're questioning, right? Well, your first step is to go see, well, has anybody else wondered this? And one of the worst things, especially if you're a student trying to come up with like a research thing, is invariably you'll find somebody who's already tried to answer this. In that case, you either have to do it a different way, use a different method, or pick something different. In science, and in the way we do science, and the way somebody has that as a job, a lot of scientists work in academia, and to keep your job, you gotta do research and publish papers and find new things, right? So you want to make sure, sadly enough, you've got to make sure the things you're researching are going to pay off in the end. All right, so you come up with something, you do a lit review, you read everything you can read at all about the subject. You got to know all the people who've ever done it. And then you got to go beg for money. Because if you want to move forward, somebody's got to pay for that. If you're doing field work, somebody's got to pay for you to get to the field. Maybe, you need an airplane ride. If you're studying volcanoes, you got to get on an airplane and go visit a real volcano that's actually erupting, right? You need the equipment. If you're taking data out in the field, if you're doing research in a lab, maybe with stuff you've already got, you've got to pay to use like lab machines. If you want somebody to use a scanning electron microscope on your teeny tiny, critter you found, that's not cheap, and you've got to find a way to actually pay for that. So a lot of science is actually trying to find money and trying to find funding. But hopefully you get that and you collect your data. And there's lots of different ways you can do it. It's not just setting up an experiment, inside a science lab. In geology, we go outside a lot, and you sometimes pick up rocks. Sometimes you measure things. Sometimes you get images from a satellite. You don't have to leave. You just sit in your chair in your office and pull remote sensing data. There's lots of different ways you can collect data and make observations. Well, then sometimes your whole thing fails and you have to start over again. And then there's verifying the data, making sure it's good, collaborating with other people. I told you it's a very collaborative sort of science, and very little science is done alone anymore, which is awesome because two brains with different kind of backgrounds can really hit problems a lot harder, which is awesome. So when you feel like you've maybe learning something, you have to present your work. And we tend to do that at conferences. Sometimes you go to major national or international conferences. Sometimes it's at smaller local ones. But it's really important to, this is another way of finding collaborators and sharing what you're doing. Because you've got new, fresh eyes. And somebody may be like, oh, did you not see that I'd already done that? Or they can find the good things in your work or the flaws and that kind of stuff. I joked about getting heckled, but sadly it happens sometimes. So you present at these conferences, you get lots of background, a lot of really, hopefully really good feedback. Then you write. It's amazing how much time is spent writing as a scientist, whether it's writing papers to get published or writing grant proposals. You write the paper, but then you got to submit it somewhere to a journal. Like you don't just create a blog on WordPress and put all your stuff up there. You actually have to get it published and hopefully in a respected academic journal, which means you go through all sorts of layers of people looking at it. And this is the peer review process, which is super important again. So there's the dreaded reviewer two, and there's almost always a reviewer two, right? So an editor decides it's maybe good enough. So they send it to reviewers. And so other people who are experts in what you're trying to do, they read it and they look for flaws in your method or things you've missed or ideas you didn't have. Well, sometimes they're like, okay, it's not bad, but you got to do more. And you sort of start this process again and go back and collect more data. Or sometimes they just reject it. And you're just not getting published, which means you start again. But you can't send the exact same paper to a bunch of different journals. So when one of them rejects your paper, you have to take a step back and make changes, get more data, add more stuff, change something, try to figure out why it got rejected in the first place. And it often takes a while. I hear stories on Twitter of people talking where it's a paper they started 5 years ago that's maybe finally getting published. And that's just the paper part and not the data collection part, which can take forever too. So sometimes this takes time. So hopefully finally it's published, more than 2 people read it, because there's a lot of journals at this point. And hopefully somebody reads it and they're like, that's interesting. And they apply your method to something they're doing. Or they're like, that doesn't sound right. I'm going to test what you did. Because one of the most important parts of science is that you get the same results each time. So, sometimes people will go back and redo your entire experiment and your entire research again, just to see if you got the same answers. And then, congratulations, you got your paper published. But if you're in academia, in order to have a job and keep a job, at least in research academia, well, that one paper is not enough. So you need another publication. So you start again and again and again. And all of this, so it's not this like linear method. At any point in this process, you get kicked out and started again. Or you change to one of the other levels all of a sudden. It's a circular process often. I found this example, which I thought was pretty cool. It's from the University of California Museum of Paleontology. It's a really cool website. There's a link here. So if you're in my class and you have this, I give you this document, you can actually go to that and look at it because there's a really cool interactive version of this. But you can see that kind of there is a lot of different steps, and you can see that those circles point in all sorts of different directions. And sometimes you can see personal motivation or serendipity. Sometimes you get lucky and just happen to sit next to the right person at the right time who says, that sounds a little familiar to something I've seen. One of my favorite examples is a geneticist was studying human history. And somewhere around 70,000 years ago, there was an event that geneticists tend to call the bottleneck. And what they can see from our DNA, I'm not a geneticist, so don't ask details. But what they can see from human DNA is that around 70,000 years ago, there was a really big die-off. And the variety and the variability in the human genomes went down. And I guess that's an indication that a lot of people died and there weren't very many people alive. I know sometimes I've read examples where they think it might have been even only like 400 breeding pairs. We're just animals, right? But like 400 or total like 800 people who could reproduce to create, all the people we have now. And so this guy was presenting his work at a university. A lot of times people come in, rather than going to conferences, they'll come in and speak at different universities, or they're invited as a guest speaker. It's pretty common. And this, volcanologist or geologist happened to be sitting here listening to his presentation, and caught him afterwards and was like, you know what? I read this paper a while ago about a really big volcanic eruption, and I think it happened about the same time as where you noticed the bottleneck. And it was this like little conversation outside, in the hallway that actually led them to understanding the eruption of a volcano known as Toba and what that meant for like the history of humans, which is pretty amazing. So there's always the butterfly effect, right? It's those little things that change, what happens. Sometimes you get lucky and technology changes and allows you to be able to collect some, kind of data. Einstein and his theory of relativity, and again, that's physics. That's sort of beyond my scope. But he made a prediction, and his theory made a prediction about the way light bends because of gravity. But there was no way to test it at the time. They actually had to wait, and I think it was like maybe the 80s, until the technology was good enough to be able to measure it, and they were actually able to use new equipment during a solar eclipse and was actually able to measure that bending because they had the new technology years and years later. So, some things we just maybe don't quite know yet. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what sets science apart from other things. So it's naturalistic, right? So we're looking at natural things around us, and we're using even with some pretty sophisticated tech, we're still looking at the natural world. We're also going to use that observation and experiments and calculation to try to explain how nature's working. It's based on empirical evidence. So this is information acquired by an observer, right? So your observation, there's some rules to observations. I'll give you here a second. So here's a little GIF. And so you could make some observations. It appears that there's blue sky at the top of the image, some kind of rocky, maybe hill with a hole in the middle, not a lot of vegetation, and I see clouds coming up, and the clouds are mostly gray, a little bit of white. Okay, great. Those are all things that we can see. And everybody that's going to come by can say, there's the sky, there's rocks, not a lot of vegetation, there's clouds. We're going to have very similar observations. And then you gotta make an inference. You're like, okay, what does all that mean? And you might be, there is a giant steam room beneath there. And the gnomes use the steam room, and when they're in there, it releases these clouds. That's one thing you can sort of interpret. Or, if you use a little bit of sense, maybe you'll figure out that this is a volcanic eruption. And the clouds we see are actually like ash and water vapor. Right? So in science, there's those observations. And the observation is some type of fact, right? And you got to use your senses. You got to taste it. You got to feel it. You got to be able to measure it and describe it somehow, right? So you can't scientifically measure how happy something makes you, right? Like, how happy are you right now? Well, there's not really a way to measure it. There's some things biologists try to do, serotonin, dopamine, that kind of stuff. But what does it mean for you? You can't really measure it. But, there are some things we can measure. We can measure temperature. We can measure size. We can measure color. Those kind of stuff. And then the inference or interpretation. This is how we make a guess or possible explanation for all those observations that we've made. And obviously sometimes it can be silly. There's no gnomes in a steam room, right? I mean, it makes more sense that it's a volcano. But that jump from observation to the inference, that's where science can split. That's where two people can look at the same data but make different inferences. And to sort of figure that out, which one's correct, it's a lot of times you need more observation. You need more data. So science, often we hear this term, it's just a theory. The theory of evolution, gravitational theory, heliocentric theory. Except in science, we use that word pretty seriously. So a hypothesis, it's an educated guess, right? Well, there's a lot more to a guess. But it's a suggested solution that doesn't really fit what we know right now. Cool. So that's like your base start. But it's got to be supported or refuted by that empirical data we were talking about. Now, a theory, though, it's an inferred explanation, right? Here's your jump to that inference, but there's abundance of evidence. It's passed all sorts of tests. A lot of people have been like, but what if we do this data? But what if we do this experiment? And it hasn't failed it. It's passed every single thing. So, a theory is actually really, really well supported in actuality. But then sometimes we have laws. Now it sounds like maybe we know that the law is right more than we know a theory is right. Correct? Not really. A law is a kind of a bigger picture. So it's a more generalization or kind of big relationships. And sometimes it's only under certain conditions. So when you look at gravity, there's Newtonian gravity. And you can use, what Newton's doing, dropping things on Earth, normal human speeds, normal human lifespans. But then you get into like Einstein physics, where, you're at the extremes of things. The world looks different and the universe works a little differently under those two different conditions, right? And so that's okay. But the important thing is, on this one, there's no other way to explain it. It has been tested and tested and tested and tested, and there's just nothing that's left. But scientific knowledge is tentative. And then it sounds weak, even in my head, but that's one of the cool things about science. So we have a rule. If you've noticed from that page before, nothing is ever proven. Maybe it can pass a test. It can be well supported, but it's never proven. We can never prove anything. We can only disprove everything else. And sometimes our inferences are not right. Maybe there's some little thing we missed. Maybe it's under a condition that doesn't cover everything. Maybe we just don't have the technology yet to understand it better. And so science, our scientific knowledge, how we make inferences based on our observations, those inferences change over time. And our understanding of it changes over time. But that's the exciting thing. Because, 100 years ago, they blamed earthquakes on, the earth being hollow at one point. At one point, they had to work really hard to figure out why volcanoes erupted. And then poof, all of a sudden in the 1960s, suddenly we knew all about the layers of the earth and how the crust is broken. And we knew about tectonic plates and tectonic forces that just, all those little puzzle pieces that had been collecting through all of history all fit really nicely into this plate tectonic theory, right? So we're constantly learning, constantly changing. But there's also things we just don't know. There's things we don't know to ask. And so that's why there's always room moving forward.